understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Dillon. I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics. So today's episode 16. Today's episode has some depth to it. If you've been listening to each episode in the past few months, then I think you can handle this episode. It's definitely not a word. So episode 16 today is all about kenosis. This is not a word that I would have introduced in one of our first episodes. But I think we've laid enough groundwork now that we can go here. You think so?
I think so.
Okay. So there have been quite a few episodes now where we've actually kind of casually brought up this word kenosis. And we keep saying we're going to do an episode on it. And today is the day. And you might be thinking, I've never even heard this word before. I don't really care. But this is actually one of the most interesting words in the whole Bible. This word has everything to do with one of the most interesting and confusing aspects of Christianity, which is the belief that Jesus was God.
Ooh.
So kenosis, it comes from the Greek word that means emptying, right? This self-emptying, this emptying of self. And this word can be found in Philippians chapter 2. I'm going to read the verses. So again, in English, it gets translated as emptying. In the original Greek, it was kenosis. So Philippians chapter 2, verses 6-7, it discusses Jesus, and it says that though he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, assuming human likeness. So the really important parts there for the context of kenosis is it says that Jesus emptied himself and took the form of a slave. So when it says emptied in English, in Greek it was originally this word kenosis. So we're really going to focus in on this emptying. So if you read the Bible, if you were to read this, you would just read over it. Emptied himself, took the form of a slave, but there's actually a lot going on here. So before we get into this, just know, as always, there is a world of research and spirituality and writing around this word kenosis. We are doing a very brief overview, and we're being partial, right? Because you can't possibly cover every perspective of this word. It's been dived into so much for so long. Kenosis, it's kind of a philosophy in itself that could be really explored endlessly, like all these things. But kenosis there's a lot of depth here. So we're just this is the tip of the iceberg.
This is such an interesting topic for me personally, because I resonate much more with the kenosis of Jesus in Philippians than I do with like the titles of Jesus, the Son of God.
Yeah.
I fully embrace the title, the only Son of God, the Son of God, and yet it makes much more sense to me that Jesus self-emptied himself to have the fullness of God in him, which also we talked about in another episode. Kind of shows how the beauty of fully human and fully divine come together. You have the fully human body. And yet at the inner parts of your whole being, your soul, your spirit, has the fullness of God. That, to me, is much more attractive than saying just that, Jesus is the Son of God or something like that.
Yeah.
The whole idea that God, especially at Christmas time, God Emmanuel, God with us in the person of Jesus, I find that much more... much more compelling.
Well, I remember whenever I first started going to church, and Dillon and I were part of this kind of like a Bible study group, at a church that he had. I always forget. It's not your internship. Your
ministerial field work.
Field work at. So we were going to this church, and we joined this Bible study type group at the church, and I remember sitting there. I have distinct memories. I'm almost embarrassed about it now, but it's true, so I'm going to say it. I would sit there and be like, I'm on board. Like, let's talk about Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I'm on board with Spirit. Got it. Check. That was never hard for me. But the Jesus part of Christianity was a slow burn for me. I didn't get it. And I would go to these Bible studies and I would just I would sit there with my arms crossed and just be like, I don't get it. Can somebody please explain to me this Jesus is God stuff? Because I'm not there. I'm not sure I can ever be there. I don't get it. I was a skeptic. I still am sometimes, obviously. But do you remember that? I would sit there. I mean, I would get almost viscerally mad, like, I don't get it. Somebody, this is literally how I would talk at these Bible studies, like, I don't get it. Somebody explain to me why we think Jesus is God. I don't understand at all. And then a few years ago, I came across this word, kenosis. I'm like, oh, I get it now. I get it. I'm on board. I got it. Yeah. Yeah. Just to so if you're listening to all this and you're like, I don't understand. Yeah. And we'll get there in the conclusion. But so let's talk about this Philippians text. It says that Jesus emptied himself and took the form of a slave. So I study language and culture. So I'm going to kind of ground this in Jesus's time and culture for us. And if you want to jump in with any theology stuff, go for it. Obviously, I do touch on some theology stuff because it's hard not to. But so, all right, Jesus emptied himself, kenosis. Jesus emptied himself and took the form of a slave. Often we think that whenever Jesus is called a slave, that this means like, oh, Jesus was a servant. But there's actually a lot more going on here. So remember, if you've been listening to all of our episodes so far, you already know this. Or maybe you knew this already. But the Roman Empire conquered the Jewish people and was oppressing the Jewish people during Jesus' lifetime. In the Roman system, people who were poor and could not afford to sustain themselves, meaning they couldn't afford food, they didn't have land or a home to have a farm on or to live in or whatever, they became enslaved to a Roman family. Many, many Jews during Jesus' lifetime were becoming enslaved to Romans during this time. So in this Roman political and social setup, enslaved people were viewed as empty vessels without minds or agencies of their own, without thoughts of their own, right? Enslaved people were seen as like the lowest of the low. They were seen to not even have a sense of self, which was obviously not the case. By the way, we have said the same thing in the United States about enslaved people not so long ago in our nation's history. And of course, this is untrue, right? Enslaved people are victims of a corrupt system. They are not absent of a sense of self. So this is untrue. But during Jesus' lifetime, this is what many people believed. And they believed that these enslaved people being empty of a sense of self actually resulted in all this kind of empty internal space for demons to come in and take them over. So enslaved people were believed to be more easily possessed, often by demonic powers, but often it was also seen that perhaps they could be susceptible to divine power as well. It was also, just to really drive this home, it was believed that if this sounds crazy to you, remember this is 2,000 years ago, right? Like we didn't have microscopes to see biology and like all this stuff. So this was how reality was seen. And I'm sure 2,000 years from now, people will look back on us now and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they believed those things, right? So it was also believed during Jesus' lifetime that women were more empty and void. And this is all wrapped up with the fact that women bleed once a month for a large portion of their lives. And this bleeding made people think that since blood could easily leave a woman's body, they must be more porous and therefore more open and susceptible to demon possession. By the way, this is why so much of our known human history, women who were struggling with anything, mental illness, pregnancy, motherhood, just struggling with anything, they were quickly said to be possessed by a demon, right? They were seen as porous, so kind of more like penetratable by the spirits, and often it was thought they were demons. There is a story in the Bible, a pretty famous story about a woman who was bleeding for 12 years and wanted healing, and she thought if she just touched Jesus's cloak, she would be healed. Jesus turns to her and says that her faith has made her well. Oftentimes this story is read as like, oh, Jesus is magical and he's healing just by looking at somebody. No, what is happening here is the point is not that Jesus is magically healing her. It's that when women are bleeding, they are seen as open and porous and vulnerable to demon possession. This woman was told by many people that she was demon possessed and she was vulnerable to demon control. And that was the problem. Because she was bleeding so much, she was so porous and open to demon control, she was seen as less than, she was dismissed. Like women and enslaved people have been viewed for really a long time, not just during Jesus's time. But Jesus turns around and embraces her. This is Jesus saying, I know people say that you're a problem and vulnerable because you bleed, but I'm saying you are okay, and I'm saying you are well. You are fine. And it's actually really powerful.
And that is what brought her to the wholeness and healing.
Right, yeah. Being told, hey, I embrace you. I know that this Roman culture, I know this society has pushed you to the margins. Jesus, over and over again, when you read these healing stories, oftentimes what he's doing is saying, I see you and you're part of this too.
Yeah, Jesus' whole healing ministry is about taking people who were unseen, untouched, uncared for, and literally embracing them, both physically and emotionally, and saying, God is here for you.
Yeah.
When you see me, you see God, and through God's love and embrace, you come to wholeness. You come.
What
to
is the
healing.
story we were just talking about before we hit record? The sick people that Jesus touched and the spit.
Oh, there was a blind man, and he needed his sight restored, and Jesus took his hands and he spit in them, and he made a salve, and he rubbed them over the blind man's eyes, and the man could see.
There was another one. Oh my gosh, why can't I think of when people were sick and they were put into communities and couldn't touch people?
Oh, the lepers.
Thank you, lepers. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. Even the lepers, it wasn't about him healing the lepers. I'm not dismissing that. Sure, maybe.
Well,
but
no, it was about him healing the lepers.
Yeah, we can define healing. We can
What
do a
is
whole
what
episode
is
on healing?
what is healing?
Yeah, healing
What is healing?
Healing is to bring people into the
healing
fold.
is different than curing.
There you go.
It doesn't say that he cured it. He could have, and maybe he even did. But healing someone and curing somebody are two totally different things.
That's good. So that's really good. So let me amend that. I'm not denying that he cured. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, he could have.
But that's actually not interesting to me. I don't need...
But he did heal them.
Yes. That's the whole point, is that these lepers who were like untouchables, you couldn't touch them, don't even be near them, he touched them. He embraced them. He hugged them.
I think...
That's the point, is that Jesus is saying, I know that other people are pushing you to the margins and saying you're unworthy and untouchable, but you're not.
There is still a rite, a practice, a custom of the church that the pastor is called to go and anoint with oil the sick and the dying to bring them healing. When I anoint people with oil in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit with oil, and I pray with them, that is to bring them wholeness and healing in the state that they are. That is not saying that just because we do this, you will indeed be cured. Both things can work together.
It's not denying miraculous stories.
No,
that
because
people have.
as a chaplain at Hershey Medical Center, I have seen real miracles. Not a plethora of them, but people who once had a tumor and they no longer have a tumor. It's gone on the scan. Where the hell did it go? I don't know, but it's not there. And yet, at the same time, the rites of the church, the customs of the church, just like Jesus was practicing and doing a healing ministry, he was a healer. He was bringing people to healing and wholeness. Sometimes, perhaps, that also cured people. And
Right.
and if you even read most of the stories of Jesus say that Jesus healed people. There is some curing stories, but curing and healing are not always. They can be parallel, but they're not. They're not interchangeable.
Right.
It's not the same thing.
And this has to do with kenosis, because kenosis is a process. Listen, for me, I'm not interested in a God who can go around curing everybody, because then listen, in a utopia, in an ideal world, sure. But that's not the reality we find ourselves in. But I don't want for me, a religion or a God who can go around curing everything, because what does that mean for me? I can't do that, so I might as well just wait around for a God who can. But having a God in the form of Jesus who can go around healing by including people who are left out of the systems that be, I can do that. I can do that. I can follow in those footsteps. I can be a part of this ongoing creation. I'm not just sitting around to be waiting like a damsel in distress waiting to be saved. I can be a part of this co-creation. I can heal by including. And that's something I can constantly wake up and do more of each day.
A part of the baptismal service is this idea that in baptism God cleanses us and rids us and separates things in our lives that draw us from God, so that God's fullness can come towards us. And I think about every child or every adult that is baptized is anointed and sealed with the Holy Spirit, so that they too can be people who bring wholeness and healing.
Well, and we did a whole episode on the word baptism, so go back and listen to that for the
right,
full
but
context,
what I'm saying,
because it's related.
This baptism and even kenosis, this emptying and putting on the fullness of God and following the teachings of Jesus to bring healing and wholeness, like Jesus did, that there's a direct connection.
Right. Yeah. So the reason we say all of this about women and enslaved people being seen as open to and vulnerable to both demonic and divine kind of energies or powers to control them, I don't even know if control is the right word there, but in the context of Jesus's culture and time, for Jesus to empty himself, right, this kenosis, empty himself like a slave, as stated in Philippians, this can be seen as him once again. If you've been listening to our episodes, this comes up again and again. Jesus is in alignment with the enslaved more than the enslavers, in alignment with the women more than the powerful Jewish men and Roman men, right?
And and the lepers. I mean, the poor lepers. Honestly, those people. I mean, many people. I just don't want to uplift the lepers, but I mean, those people were totally ostracized.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I mean, for something arguably beyond their control.
Yeah. Well, so the women and the enslaved people, right? That's what it means to be like when Jesus emptied himself and became like a slave. That's what it means. Not that he was a servant to everybody, but that he was aligning himself with slaves, with enslaved people who were thought to be empty and therefore more susceptible to being filled with either demons or God, right? It can go...
It could go either
way, right? So another way to think about this, again, if you're somebody who's like, oh my gosh, they're talking about demons and being filled with God, we're talking about the way people viewed reality still today, many people, but also this is how people who lived during Jesus' lifetime saw the world. People were susceptible to demonic energies and divine energies, and I mean, this is a common part of human history.
And again, like you just said, there is a multitude of individuals and groups that still believe that today.
And people have experiences, yeah. So for Jesus to be filled with divine power, so if you don't understand kenosis, we're about to really explain it. For Jesus to be filled with divine power, for Jesus to be fully human and God, he had to become empty, like enslaved people were presumed to be, to kind of make room to be filled up with this divine kind of spirit-led way of living. So another way to think about this is that those filled with earthly power and ego, right? If somebody has a lot of power in our systems today, world leaders, like, even the most humble among them, they have a certain degree of power. And there's often, unless you really do power well, and there's a few people who can, there's ego attached to that, right? So another way to think about this kenosis is really the dying of ego. So if you have too much ego, and I'm going to really define ego, so hold on. But if you have too much ego, you're too full of self to be filled with God, to be like in alignment with God. So in Acts 16, it tells the story of an enslaved woman following Paul. I really want to make this enslavement point. So in Acts 16, it tells the story of an enslaved woman following Paul and crying out, saying, "These men are slaves of the Most High God," right? We hear this language about being a slave to God all throughout the Bible. And this kenosis, Jesus emptying himself and becoming a slave, being called a slave of God, right? To be a slave of God was very subversive language against the enslavers, which were the Romans, right? The Roman Empire. This is especially compelling when we consider the fact that both enslaved and enslavers were members of the early Jesus communities. That's a whole other conversation, but early Jesus communities had both enslaved people and enslavers as part of these communities. So there's like this reckoning, and they're being called a slave to God, right? So, which is giving power to the enslaved people more. Also, to be a slave of God was to say that I'm obedient to a way of life that goes beyond my master. My Roman master is not who I follow or obey. I actually follow and obey God. So it's actually a way to resist your Roman master. It meant you belong to God, not your Roman master, not to the politics of the time. Does that make sense? Did I explain that in a way that makes sense?
That's very good. And also, can I throw a little something in here? This is interesting. In the passage from Philippians, in the book or epistle to the Philippians, in which St. Paul wrote, we're not told when this happened to Jesus.
The process of kenosis.
We're not told when it happened to Jesus. We're not told how old Jesus was. And there has been many different theologies and philosophies and concepts over time that, this very moment, whenever this was when Jesus became fully human and fully divine. I would like to just make a quick systematic theology note here that the church, as an institution, the Christian church, Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox, have said that this type of self-emptying and the fullness of God and the fullness of humanity together, Jesus didn't become this later. Jesus was this from the very beginning.
That's the official doctrine.
That is the official doctrine, and so that is why it's connected to infant baptism, because this kenosis is not something that you need to choose or you need to become. It's a gift of God.
Yeah, I want to talk more about.
And so I just want to. Because here's the thing, we have to think about this. If kenosis is not a gift of God, and it's something that we can achieve,
then we are all many gods.
Then not only are we all many gods, but that keeps out people with intellectual disabilities. Mm-hmm. That keeps out people who can't speak or cognitively come to the fullness of understanding. It keeps out young children. So this idea that kenosis only happens when you're older and mature may not or is not the only way of understanding kenosis. In other faiths and other religions outside of Christianity, and the idea of kenosis, self-emptying, and enlightening, bringing in the fullness of God, can only happen because of choice and choosing and moving forward. Works, especially if you're a Protestant. One thing about If you're a Protestant, you do not come to the fullness of God's love through your works. You come to the fullness of God because of God's love and grace and forgiveness. And so the idea that Jesus had to choose this or become this, that actually,
Yes.
we're not even told that.
Well, can we just take a quick
So I'm
side
sorry,
note? It all belongs. We're really going to ground kenosis in a moment. So if you're still like, I don't get what it is, don't worry. We're going to really ground it in a minute.
I'm sorry, I bunny trailed
But
it.
I think bunny trails are part of the path. So let's go down another bunny trail. So, hold on, I'm losing it. What were you just talking about? I know.
It's
Okay,
not
so
earned.
I'm not going to pretend to be... Christianity is what I know, right? I'm going to go the depth with Christianity probably until I die, because I like to go the depth. And so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in Buddhism, but I do want to talk about Buddhism and some other really beautiful traditions. Hinduism, but some traditions, and they're beautiful, and I think they also point to truth, and I'm there for it.
I do too. I believe that.
I'm not interested in traditions that are super focused on enlightenment. People like to talk down to Christianity and be like, oh, well, but you need to be baptized to be included. You need to do this and you need to do that. It's like, well, number one, there's a lot of surrender in Christianity, more so than like in many expressions of Christianity. It's not all about like, you need to do this to be included. But these traditions that are really focused on enlightenment, there's a lot of work involved there. There's not much surrender in some expressions of those too, right? Like I think about the bunny trail I want to go on really quickly is Buddhism. We are colonizing it. The West is taking Buddhism and we're kind of like taking it and making it our own. And the Western expression of Buddhism
and Hinduism
is not really the original thing, and perhaps it never could be whenever you take it and make your own. And I don't know if I think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I do want to acknowledge that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm really into Buddhism right now. It's like, no, you're not actually. You're into a Western expression that's been kind of manipulated to meet our own needs. You're not actually into Buddhism. And people like to do that to separate themselves from Christianity. I think that's fine. I know Christianity has done harm, but some of these traditions, some of these more Eastern traditions especially, we like to take it and be like, oh, well, all you have to do is meditate and blah, blah. No, they're saying that you have to achieve a certain way of living in order to be enlightened. And it's kind of this like, I picture it like a ladder that you have to climb in order to be worthy or good enough. Do you know what I mean? In some expressions of them, they're also beautiful.
Absolutely.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I agree. Yeah, I agree that Buddhism and Hinduism are deeply beautiful, and I think there's truth in those faiths. And yet, the Christian faith that we're talking about, and kenosis and the life and teachings of Jesus, and a kenosis that we also can have.
Kenosis is about surrendering, not working.
Because we're connected to Jesus, is surrendering, and it's something that God guides us through, not something that we have to live up to or live into.
Right.
Or it's not about our own personal choice or personal decision to climb a ladder. It's about God's grace and love that nurtures us in self-emptying and putting on the fullness of God to follow in the teachings of Jesus, which is a beauty and a truth. And so it's about what God does for us and has done for us, not what we have to earn or do or work to.
So before we really ground kenosis,
I'm sorry, was that too much?
No, it's not.
That's my
I want to
Protestant
make that
in
point.
me there.
I want to make that point because when we talk about kenosis, it's going to sound like something you have to do to be a better person. That's
But it's
not what kenosis is. It's
No.
not another ladder to climb. The great mystery of spirituality and personal growth, or whatever you want to call it, is how come some people get it and some people don't? How comes there's some people who are possibly in their last decade of life and they're just mean and grumpy and miserable, and they complain and they gossip about everybody and they have a problem with everything? Why? And then why is it that other people are living, they're just free. They're just free and they're kind and they've stepped into some kind of liberation. Do you know what I mean? It's the great mystery. And there's a spectrum, right? Why is it that some people grow and other people on the outside, it seems like they're just stuck? Is it trauma? Is it harm? Is it how it's the great mystery of a spiritual life. It's the great mystery. Why does it seem like some people get it and some people don't?
Well,
so
right,
I'm
and
not
it's
sure.
it's the ancient question of
Really quick, I believe on a long enough timeline that extends into death, we all get it. By the way,
Oh, yeah.
I'm not somebody who thinks that some people get it, and I'm also not one of those people who thinks that Christianity is the only way. I think it's a big house with a lot of doors, and Christianity is one door. I want to be super clear about that. I am not putting us above anybody.
No, I'm not
But
either.
if we're gonna criticize Christianity, let's criticize everything through this with the same hardship.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got excited.
No.
So, anything else before we really ground this?
No, we have to ground it.
Yeah, we gotta ground it because I feel like we're half an hour in and everybody's like, what are they talking about? Okay, so let's really ground what is kenosis? What is this self-emptying? So I'm gonna warn you, it's gonna get woo-woo. We're gonna ground it, but it's also gonna be kind of like transcendent at the same time. So, what does kenosis actually mean for Jesus' identity as God? So Christians believe that Jesus was God in human form, right? That's what we believe. I can tell you 5 years ago I did not believe that, and now I do very deeply. So there are many ways and understandings about how this could be and how kenosis ties into this. All of this will always be up for debate because the entire Christian story has always been and continues to be up for debate. And it really gets into the world of theology and philosophy, which are things that by their nature are not provable through a scientific lens. So I want to start there. I'm not interested in bringing science into this conversation because it's the very nature of reality that's been being debated when we talk about kenosis, right? It's just this highly theological kind of concept that it cannot be observed, it can only be experienced. So I want to start there. So I hope that makes sense. So this self-emptying, this kenosis, this emptying, helps us begin to explore how Jesus and God could be aligned in this way. So I think of this self-emptying, I'm explaining this the best way I can. It's similar to ridding yourself of your ego. So first, let's define ego. Our identity, not our ego, but our identity is the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. I am Samantha. I am a woman. I am a mother. I am curious. I am a professor. I am a wife. I am introverted. When I communicate, I'm a direct communicator. I am a Christian. I am intelligent. I write books. I'm a published author. I am responsible. I am reliable, right? These are all stories I tell myself about who I am. Some of these are true. Some of these on my best days are definitely true. These are all stories that I tell myself about who I am. These are identity markers. Identity is not bad. We need to have an identity. We're a person. It's fine to believe that you are a responsible person. Beautiful. It's fine to believe these things about yourselves. It's fine to have an identity. Ego is not your identity. Ego is the attachment to your identity. It's the attachment to these stories. So part of the story that I tell myself about my identity, part of my identity is that I'm a responsible and, so I'm going to tell a story. I wasn't going to, but I'm going to. Part of my identity is I tell myself I am a reliable and responsible person. It's important to me, right? It's actually part of my ego because I'm attached to that story about myself. So a couple years ago, me and my family, and at the time our Tabitha, who's 4 now, Sophia, our 2-year-old, was not born yet, Dillon and his family, and his almost 90-year-old grandmother, his brother, and our sister-in-law, right, all these people, we decided to go on vacation to Vermont. And I planned it. I found the house, I collected everybody's money, right? I was kind of managing this vacation. And we got there, I don't remember what day, was it like a Thursday? I'm going to make up the days of the week. It was a Thursday that we got there. And we pulled up to this house. This is like a 10-hour drive, I don't know. 8 hours.
Yeah.
I mean,
It was
stops and everything. It was a long drive.
But worth it.
We had a child, we had a dog with us. Dillon's parents had his almost 90-year-old grandmother. We get there, we're there first, just me and Dillon and our daughter and our dog. We get there, and people are in the house that we rented for the week. And they're playing basketball in the yard and in the driveway. And I pulled out my phone and looked at the email, it was the day early. I got us all there a day early. I cried. I was mortified. We started calling hotels before we even called anybody who were a couple hours behind us. We started calling hotels. We couldn't find a hotel room anywhere. I'm not sure why. Was there some event going on? I don't know. Couldn't find a hotel room anywhere for us to stay in. Also, not to mention a hotel room for that many people, which I was already committed to paying for because it was my mess up. My identity as a responsible and reliable person is so a part of my ego because I'm attached to that identity that my sense of self came crashing down. And then what inevitably happens, so my ego is the attachment to that story about myself. Am I making sense so far? I'm going to keep going.
Sure.
Okay. So my ego is not the fact that I am reliable and responsible or believe myself to be. It's my attachment to the story. Here's what happens whenever your attachment to the story goes wrong. I see myself as reliable and responsible. I failed to be reliable and responsible one time because I got us all to this vacation 24 hours early and we had nowhere to go. Just to end the story, we did find a hotel. Everybody was very nice about it. I cried a lot. It was terrible.
But we got to spend a lovely, beautiful day in Burlington, Vermont.
We did. It all worked out.
And it's a beautiful city, and Vermont is such a beautiful state. And so all was well.
All was well, but it hurt my ego because it threatened my sense of identity and sense of self. And when our egos are hurt, do you know what we do? We become defensive. That voice that tells us we're not good enough in our head, it gets louder. We beat ourselves up. Our ego kind of gets bigger and inflates to compensate, right? Like in my head, I was like telling myself the story so I could like keep this story going that I'm responsible and reliable. My ego was saying things like, well, I'm the one who planned this anyway. I'm the one who did all the work and all the, like, right? The ego gets defensive, right? That's how you know when somebody is operating from a place of ego, because they overcompensate and they blow up their sense of self, and in order to drown out the voices that tell them they're not good enough, they start saying, I am good. I'm the one who did all this. I'm the only one who does anything around here, right? It's terrible. It's terrible. That's the ego. So this kenosis, it's similar to the dying of the ego. And it can be a beautiful thing because when we let go of our ego, this process can also be called kenosis, right? It's one way to think of it. This is just one way to think of it. What we realize, and what Dillon helped me when I was crying in the car and I felt my ego latching onto this story, being attached to this story that I'm reliable and trying to keep this story intact because my reliability failed one time. Dillon helped me surrender to it and change the story a little bit and let go of the story a little bit. And again, this is called kenosis, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ego. Okay. So Father Richard Rohr, he's a Franciscan monk. He talks about the two parts of life. The first part is where we build up our egos, right? We all need an ego because your ego can't die if you don't have an ego to die, right? So it's necessary, right? We build up our egos. And the second part of our life is where our egos die. And we all are hopefully in this process. This is a process of kenosis. For many of us, it's a slow process, right? It's a never-ending process. We get older and wiser, and we realize that the parts of our identity that we used to think mattered so much, like being strong and in shape, and having a nice body, being a hard worker, and being liked by everybody who ever comes in contact with us. We realize that those stories, that those parts of our ego, those stories that we tell about ourselves, they just don't really matter as much anymore. We start to wake up to the fact that there's this kind of truer and more permanent self behind the ego, and we can access that truer self when our ego dies, right?
Yeah, that's good.
And listen, it's often a slow death for a lot of us, but this is the Christian way. And for us Christians, we claim the belief that Jesus did this process of kenosis fully and completely. He was so empty of ego and self that God dwelled fully within him, and that is why he is our example, right? So, I mean, we can debate. I think Dillon and I might even have different, I don't even know if I have a formed belief on this, but we can debate whether or not people are capable of this full process of kenosis. I think this can also I think enlightenment comes into this a little bit. I think some people call this process something similar to enlightenment, right?
Or the Eastern Christian churches call it divinization.
Yeah.
Which the Western church has kind of not wanted to talk about, because divinization means people think of divine only with God, and yet in the book of Genesis, in that beautiful poetic mythic poem that tells us of the story of creation, it says that we all have been made in the not only the image of God but the likeness of God. And Jesus too, we see it in the passage from Philippians, had the likeness. And so I love what there's a passage in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament that says that Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter of the faith. So he's the one who kind of shows us, the pioneer, the starter, who shows us the fullness of who God is, and he kind of perfects it so that we can live into that. How we can get there fully, that's of no interest to me. But I think I'm more interested in the journey and how God perfects that in me over time. That's
so,
God's role.
Yeah, in the Western world, especially in the developed Western world, we're obsessed with productivity and efficiency and goals. Kenosis is not a goal. It's not something to achieve or to arrive to. It's a way of living. It's a thing you live into. Just like I believe. So I heard a spiritual teacher once say that there's no such thing as human enlightenment. You cannot achieve full enlightenment, because when you get to the edge of enlightenment, you have to turn around and go get everybody else in all of creation and bring it with you. That's full enlightenment. And I love that. And I think kenosis is the same. And Jesus was trying to gather everybody and everything with him in this process of like, come with me. Do you know what I mean? Of this, like, sometimes language fails, but you know what I'm trying to say a little?
Yeah,
Jesus
I
wasn't
do.
on a personal journey, is my point. Jesus wasn't trying to be like, I am God. Jesus was very communal in his efforts and ministry. It's a communal thing.
I have to. There would be people that would disagree with this, but there is a line of thinking, in specifically the Western Church, including Protestants, that because of Jesus's life and teachings, his death and resurrection and ascension, which includes his kenosis, in the life and faith of Jesus, we have all experienced kenosis and we've all been perfected. And so someone could argue that no, everyone has been perfected. When and how they wake up to that is different in every individual. But once again, going back to, well, you have to work for it, or you have to wake up to it on your own and bring it to yourself. That's one way of thinking about it. But the other way of thinking, I always think, because there's that line that kind of is a little shaky with the Greek, where do we come to the fullness of understanding God, and are we justified? And I know we struggle with the word saved, because people look at that many different ways. But are we saved through the faith of Jesus Christ or the faith in Jesus Christ? And so there's this idea that if you really believe that Jesus who is the Christ did it all, in terms of even opening us up to usher in for everyone to have kenosis, if you believe that Jesus did it all, then there is no ladder climbing.
Right.
There's no need for it. We've been liberated. We've been illuminated. Now, how each individual kind of wakes up to that with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. I know I'm really talking theology terms here, but that there might be some diversity and difference. But
kenosis is also one of those words. It's hard not to get into the theology, and it's all very, I don't know. It feels philosophical to me. There's like this depth to it that can't quite be touched with language sometimes. But I do want to go ahead.
I just want to make the point that kenosis, this idea of emptying or self-emptying, is something that comes from God, not us. Because I believe, and I think the scriptures support this, I believe that God in Jesus Christ came to open this opportunity and offer this opportunity and give this opportunity to everyone. And therefore, it cannot be a ladder climbing thing or a thing on good works or merit, because there are people, like we talked about, that have intellectual disabilities, people who are have cognitive issues, that would never be able to climb the ladder to achieve this. And so it has to be for everyone. And as soon as you start putting, well, you have to be mature or you have to do this, well, now it's a work.
Right, now it's ladders.
Now it's...
I've said this in multiple episodes, but if it's just more climbing the ladder, I don't want
Oh
it.
my, I don't want
it's
that.
All day, every day I'm climbing ladders. I don't want to.
That...
It's not interesting to me. It doesn't free me. And
That's
it doesn't
not the
free
freedom
me.
of Christ.
Right, I don't want it. Okay, so let's ground this even more. This might kind of sound like fairy tale, pixie dust kind of stuff, but it's actually not that weird, and many of you have already experienced this kind of like dwelling of God within you. So let's talk about it. And if that language is weird for you, listen, me too. I'm still getting used to it. Dillon's fine with it as a pastor, but I'm still getting used to it. But as Christians, we believe Jesus lived into this kenosis entirely instead of just partially and in fragmented ways like many of us. So there's a spiritual teacher named Byron Katie. She has this kind of program and book called The Work, if you're interested, which has helped me a lot. But she has this quote where she said, "We never make a decision. When the time is right, the decision makes itself." That's kenosis in practice, right? So now that you know, maybe you already knew, but this kenosis thing, think about it. Go take it out into the world. You'll probably see people living into this process already, right? Byron Katie saying, hey, I haven't had to make a decision in years. Decisions just get made for me. That's surrendering. That's emptying yourself of ego because you're not attached to any outcome. You're not attached to any story of identity or outcome or of how reality should be. You are just letting God be God, and you are just surrendering to reality as it is. That is kenosis, this emptying of yourself, this kind of radical giving up of control that allows spirit to kind of take over your life and run the show, right? So when she says, I haven't made a decision in years, that's because you don't have to whenever you can really live into this kenosis. This is true liberation, right? This is, we don't need to manipulate or control or fight or prove ourselves. We can simply surrender. So again, kenosis is not about climbing the ladder and being good enough. It's actually about the opposite of just, I don't want to say do nothing, but well, here's another thing that will help.
This might be hard though for if you're
a control freak.
If you're a control freak, or if you're a red-blooded American who bathes themselves in the idea of individualism and working hard and having to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and do it all alone. If you are living into a philosophy, I'm just going to say it. I know it might be unpopular for some people, but that way of life, that way of living, rugged individualism where you just do it all alone, that is deeply opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
It's actually sacrilegious when people are like, oh, well, I can just do it if I'm just nice enough, if I just give to the poor. That's beautiful. Please, please, please give to the poor. That's beautiful. Give to the poor. Be a kind person. That's not the point, though. I don't want to say it's not the point. That's a huge part of it. But what you're doing when you think you can just, if I just give enough and work hard enough, and if I'm nice enough, and if I give enough money to the poor, and if I give a $20 bill every time I see a poor person asking for money on the side of the street, if I pack lunch and give it to them, what you're doing is making yourself a mini God, right? Do those things. Beautiful. Do those things. But you are not in control. You're thinking that if I'm just good enough, then everything will be fixed. That's not the point of a spiritual life. A spiritual life is, simply put, there's something bigger than me in control, so I can actually let go. And this next quote actually will help ground this, but do you have something to say first?
No, I just want to say I don't want my comment to be, I'm very proud of living in the United States and being an American, and I love this country and I love many things about it, but the idea of rugged individualism and kind of doing it all on your own and I don't need any help and I'm my own self-creation, there's some good in that, there's some beauty in that, except that most of the time, once again, you can still be a proud American and not have to embrace all those things because many of those things are counter to the gospel. They call you out of community. They call you out of experiencing the experience that Jesus had of kenosis. And so
oftentimes liberation, I'm going to use this language, liberation from any kind of bondage requires, think about AA. One of the first steps in AA rooms is you have to admit that there's a power beyond you. If you, to experience liberation from your addiction, you need to acknowledge that you are not fully in control here. That's the first step to liberation for many processes, and kenosis included, is acknowledging, oh, there's something bigger, and I'm actually not solely in control of how reality is going to be arranged and the laws of reality and the rules of reality. I'm not in control, so I can actually let go a little bit. And Liz Gilbert, so she's one of the voices in this world that has transformed me the most. If you're not subscribing to her Letters from Love Substack, you should be. I think it's one of the most beautiful places on the internet right now. But Liz Gilbert, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love. She's known for many other things. She has a new book coming out soon.
Big Magic.
Big Magic, yeah. So she says, and I love this, she says, this is how she surrenders. It's so beautiful. She says, so again, we're talking about how actually in a spiritual life, in Christianity, surrender because there's something bigger than you in control. Liz Gilbert says that when it's time for her to take action, she will be notified. That's kenosis in action, right? That's kenosis in practice. And I feel that too, right? I love this so much. So again, this is kenosis. It's refusing to force things, but instead being still enough to hear that quiet voice, or just to feel that gentle nudge, right? That still quiet voice. Isn't that the phrase in the King James Version of the Bible? To hear, what us Christians call God, that's a word that I'm still getting used to, but is our daughter up from her nap?
I don't think so.
Okay, good. So it's kind of quieting, and that doesn't mean going into solitude. It just means kind of quieting yourself down. Don't be distracted. Just be aware enough to know that when it's time for you to take action, you will be notified. You will be told. You will feel the gentle nudge. You will hear the voice. When it's time for you to write the next chapter of your book, when it's time for you to maybe go to a rally to speak out against something, when it's time for you to engage that person that you've been in conflict with or you've been trying to forgive for a long time, when it's time for you to take a different direction, to get a new job, to just from the most small, seemingly minute things to large things, it's time for you to move to a different state or town. You will be notified. That's Christian living. That's even spiritual living. You will be notified. Until then, stop controlling and manipulating and just calm down. That's kenosis in practice. Just let something else take over and trust that when it is time, you will be notified. I love that. So I'll even get personal. I don't know if Dillon will or not. I'll get personal about my own kind of fragmented experience of kenosis. Again, I'm not claiming to be Jesus, but we all can experience these moments of kenosis, kind of living into it, this self-emptying. It comes up for me. I know I said this in one other podcast episode. I definitely said this before, but I experience it most in my writing. So I write books. I have a book coming out next year. I write poetry. So I sit down at my desk every day with very few exceptions. Dillon can attest to that. I wake up sometimes at 3:30 or 4 in the morning. I will sit down for hours at my desk to write. And here's the thing. Some days, many days, I don't write anything. Or I write things that I end up deleting. But it is still my job to sit at the desk. And I don't usually like to talk in this woo-woo way, but I'm going to right now. This is my arrangement with God. And this might sound like works, but it's not work. It's surrendering. My arrangement is I sit down at my desk and I keep showing up. I sit at my desk for a few hours every day, most days, and the promise is that eventually the words will come. And this is a promise that is yet to be broken with me. There are days that whoever Samantha is, whatever this thing that I call my ego is, right? My angers and my anxieties, my attachments to what I think the world should be like and what I should be like and what everyone around me should be like, right? If I sit at my desk enough in quiet and like kind of still myself, right? Even when it's not quiet on the outside, even whenever my daughters are screaming and they're playing and they're making a mess, but I myself internally am quiet. And I'm not going to say that I empty myself because I don't do it. It's done for me.
Good.
It's done for me. I show up, and most days there's too much going on. I'm angry at somebody. I'm annoyed at something that somebody said to me 4 years ago that they probably don't even remember they said on a random Tuesday afternoon, right? And that's just all in my head and in my body and in my nervous system, and I can't write how I want to write. It's not working, right? But then inevitably, after a couple of weeks of this, sometimes after a couple of days, sometimes after months, showing up at my desk, knowing what I want to write about, but it's just not working, right? Inevitably, in a moment, it happens slowly, but also all at once at the same time. Everything that was Samantha is gone. Or it's there, but it's like not there. I don't know how to explain it, but it's gone. And maybe you've experienced this too somewhere in your life. A lot of people have. And something else takes over. And I have literally sat at my desk. The scientific world is starting to catch on to this phenomenon, and they call it flow state, right? Religious people would call it God. Whatever you want to call it, it takes over. And I have literally sat at my desk for hours, having perfectly formed chapters of books come out all at once. All at once. I don't have to do anything. Things I didn't even know. A voice that I hear saying, go look at that book that you read 3 years ago. So I pull out the book. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the thing, right? It just comes out. Sometimes it's not a chapter. Sometimes it's a paragraph. Sometimes it's just a sentence, right? And then I have to go months of not having... Sometimes that will last days or weeks in a row. Sometimes then I have to go months of showing up and quieting everything down until it happens to me. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Do you resonate with that at all?
Yeah, I do. I have to write a sermon in other professions. It would be a speech or whatever you want to call it. But every single week, I have to read 4 different readings and meditate on them and do research on them and choreograph them together. 4 different readings to try to give cohesion to sometimes a greater or lesser theme that's already there. And I pray a prayer before I begin all my sermons. It's the same prayer every single Sunday, and I pray that same prayer throughout the week when we look at these stories, when we look at these scriptures, that they're broken up for us, and that they are that we see something new in them, and that we are changed and we're transformed to be even more like Jesus the Christ, right? And so when I say that I'm not in control and the Spirit of God is working through me, I'm able to take sometimes 4 scriptures that might have greater or lesser connections and hopefully offer something cohesive. I have to say this is woo-woo, this is weird. When I get up and I preach...
Dillon and I struggle with woo-woo.
Whether I preach from the lectern or the pulpit, or often now I try to preach out in the midst of the people, which is a little bit more difficult for me. I am being divinely led with what I am to deliver. I myself am not the only source that is offering inspiration and a challenging message for the community that I serve. Mm-hmm. And that throughout the week, I am able to self-empty with the help of the Spirit all the gook that kind of clouds my mind, take the readings of Scripture and deliver them in a way that are inspirational and challenging to the community. That is not something that, once again, is only me.
Yes.
And that changes me. It transforms me. It self-empties things in me so that I can take on maybe not the fullness of God like Jesus did, but that God can dwell in me so that I can deliver something.
And the Christian word for this is kenosis. A more Eastern word is divinization or enlightenment, right? Another way that this has been viewed, so I got my doctorate in language and culture from Indiana University, and something that we talked about in so many of my classes, we talked about indigenous languages, right? Because many of them are gone or will be gone soon, unfortunately, and it's just a tragedy. But we talked about indigenous languages and even indigenous spirituality, and for indigenous communities, those two things are together, right? They're intertwined. I mean, for all of us, they're intertwined. But a huge thing in indigenous thought, experience, cultures is so the way we talked about it in my doctorate program, we called it other ways of knowing, which does a disservice because it's not othered, but it's other to us. In our culture, we think that the superior way of knowing is through logic and through the brain. But in indigenous wisdom, and not just indigenous people, many others, but this is what we learned about a lot in my doctorate program, there are other ways of knowing. There are things that our body knows that our brain can't know. In fact, the brain actually keeps us from it, right? Spirituality and this kenosis, right? This kenosis, this self-emptying, to be filled with the divine, be filled with God, to be aligned with God, to live in God's way, right? There's a lot of ways to talk about it. And some of the Christian language has been ruined by really harmful Christianity. And I'm trying to reclaim it for myself. But this is found in other spiritual paths as well. Indigenous people have talked about deep ways of knowing. If you've ever read the book by Robin...
Braiding Sweetgrass.
Braiding Sweetgrass, yeah, she talks all about this. There are other ways to know things. And for me, when I drop into this flow state, so this feeling of God writing through me, I also experience it sometimes as a mother with my children, and in different parts of life, but I especially consistently feel it whenever I'm writing. And writing is very important to me, and it's almost like you're high when you experience this. It's a thing that you can chase, and it's actually not chasing, it's like an awareness that you drop into. It's a presence, right? And all you have to do is kind of like sink into this. And there's this, like when people say they hear the voice of God, sometimes it's not actually hearing with the ear. It's this other deep, I mean, there have been times when you just know. Dillon and I in our marriage have experienced this a couple of times together. We have just known. When it was time for us to move to the town that we live in now, we both knew it. And we couldn't explain to other people how we knew it. We just knew it's time. This is a thing that we have to do. Sometimes you just know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's kenosis. That's what Jesus was doing. He was sinking in to this deeper awareness that as Christians, we believe he had full access to all the time. I do not have that access. I don't know why. I don't really care to know why. I just know that I don't. And it's not something that I feel like I can give my life to because it feels like ladder climbing. The only way I would know how to start to strive towards that is ladder climbing, and I'm not interested. And I don't believe Jesus had to climb a ladder to do it. It just happened.
Right. There's an old 19th century German theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. And some people really love him and some people really hate him and some people are in between. I tend to either like him or at least be in between. I definitely don't hate him. His stuff is very good, I think. And so this 19th century German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher says that he was working at the time between figuring out things and understanding things in the Bible and theology, but also trying to couple them or parallel them with new discoveries in the natural world, especially in the scientific world. And so if you couldn't base the biblical stories or the biblical experiences with history, throughout history in the Bible, then what is religion good for? What are these stories good for? And
they're good for other ways of knowing.
And he said
wisdom.
they're good for when you read these stories of Scripture, or when you hear these stories of Scripture. If you go to church and you're listening to them, you get this deep feeling inside of you that transforms you. Mm-hmm. And this idea of feeling, that someone feels something and is sometimes unexplainable. Mm-hmm. When someone has a deep knowing, a deep feeling in their heart, in their mind, their body, their soul. This is the spiritual life. This idea that one feels so deeply and knows so deeply.
A woman knows when she's in danger.
Right.
When there's somebody staring at her when she's pumping gas at nighttime from 20 feet away, she feels it, and then she looks up and she sees it. She feels it before she sees it. Some people have said things like, some people who are so obsessed with logic have said things like, they're lying to me. Well, how do you know? I just know it. What do you mean you just know?
Right.
Because there's other ways of knowing that are beyond the brain, right? So we can kind of shift into concluding it all. Do you have anything else? I feel like we gave you enough to start wrestling with this idea of kenosis.
And I think we can really try to connect as we close out here this idea that kenosis, this self-emptying and
something we can
God,
also live into.
And God, right, is that is something that one can really truly feel.
Yes.
It is a spiritual, it is a religious, deep knowing and feeling that sometimes cannot be fully explained in terms of materialism. Well, I can take this and I can test it, and then something comes out. And people have for eons, for centuries and beyond, for millennia, have been having these deep knowings and these deep feelings of deep truths. And kenosis is one of those things.
Well, I even want to talk about I'm going to really tread lightly here, but I have to be really careful. So please don't misunderstand what I say. But even that story in the Bible about a woman who was bleeding for 12 years, meaning she had her period for a very long time, which, by the way, is a reality today for many women too. They have inconsistent periods, or it lasts months in a row. I know, I have friends who have had their periods and it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes, and it's like this thing that they can't quite control or figure out, right? The belief that women are more porous and therefore more able to be kind of penetrated by the spirits, right? The belief that they are more easily demonically possessed has done so much harm. That's the root of why we call women hysterical when actually they're struggling or suffering from something very real. We call them hysterical. We say they're demon possessed, right? That's done harm, and I want to acknowledge that. But also there's some truth. This is where I want to tread lightly, but I see women oftentimes as more open to the spiritual world. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, I get what you're saying.
Women are more open.
I think that could
maybe it's because women haven't been conditionalized to have to be right about everything and logical and all these things.
But I think that could be not separated, but I think that could be not directly connected to feminine
the culturally constructed idea of what means to be feminine.
I'm struggling to use the correct words here.
It's a tricky thing to talk about, but
no, but I honestly I think of my ministry as a pastor, and I think of most of, I need to watch how I say this too. Most of the people who I see and know and experience and work with,
who can live into this kenosis,
who are living
they're not
into
attached
this
to
kenosis
identity,
and really doing the transformative ministry and mission and vision of the church.
They're being transformed.
They're being transformed, and there's no way around it.
It's women.
Women are way beyond where men are.
Yeah, and that's not an absolute. Of course, there's men too, but there's something culturally.
There's many wonderful, wonderful men who are transformed and challenged, and they bring wonderful things to the church. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to do a man versus woman thing here. I'm just saying that statistically, we for a multitude of different reasons, we see that women are playing a rather big role in executing things of the church. I was going to say something, and now I forget. I forget what I was going to say.
If it comes up in the next couple minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Even whenever, I might regret saying this, but I'm still going to say it. So sometimes there are some people, this is not something that Dillon and I, this is not part of our worldview or how we see reality, but some people think that, oh, the male is the spiritual head of the household. The people that I know who say things like that, I watch their dynamic, and no, it's the woman who's encouraging the whole family to go to church. It's the woman who has to, even this subtle thing, it's the woman who before dinner looks to her husband and says, are you going to pray now? Like reminding him, hey, you need to pray now. It's the woman who's kind of taking that leadership role, and I just think that's really, there's just something compelling about that.
Well, okay, good. I'm glad you brought this up.
Did it bring it back?
Because, yeah, it brought it back. So we can, this is not the podcast episode and topic where we can dive deep into this, and maybe we'll do something on this. But here's the thing. The biblical texts from Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament into the New Testament, there is a through line, meaning that God is working amongst many different people and many different groups and many different languages and many different cultures, and the through line is that God's presence never ceases to not exist. God's presence is always there. God's presence is with the Hebrew people. God's presence comes to us in the person of Jesus, and God's presence comes to us in the indwelling of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost and beyond. So the through line is God's presence. And yet, from the almost 1,600 years of history that are offered in the biblical texts of Old and New Testament, there are some differences of how people are understanding God, and how they see God, and how they know God, and how they feel God. And yet there's a consistency here between the Old and the New Testament. In the book of Genesis, you get this idea that humanity, that God creates humanity regardless of gender, right? Regardless of gender, in the image and likeness of God. And so everyone who is born, everyone who has an incarnation, everyone who comes into life, whether male or female or another expression, have God's image in them and God's likeness. That is for everyone. That's not only for men or only for women or only for whatever. And then also it's interesting that so there's that through line. And then it's also interesting in then the New Testament, you see when Paul is talking about baptism in the book of Galatians, he has this line, when people are baptized, they are no longer Jew or Greek. They're no longer enslaved or free. They are no longer male or female. For all are one and made new in Jesus Christ through baptism. And so this idea that baptism unites us and breaks down all these things, that
Kenosis is the ridding of ego.
Yes, kenosis is the freeing of all things.
Of our attachment to these
It doesn't
things.
mean that gender and sex don't matter. It doesn't mean that our ethnicity and our language doesn't matter. But in God sees us.
We don't need to be attached to those
We don't
things.
have to be attached to those things. And there is a through line. Every single person is made in the image of likeness of God. And at least for Christians, baptism gives us a new identity in which God sees us united to Jesus Christ, and isn't fully caught up with the externals of earthly things of what separates us. Does that make sense?
It does.
So this idea that, well, only some people can experience kenosis and some other people can't, that I would argue it cannot be true.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, and yet you can't negate that some groups are living into kenosis much more, perhaps, than others. You can see that. But that doesn't mean that not everybody
also
has
acknowledging that sometimes it's unseen, right? I think about the most transformative times in my life. People can't see the transformation that's taken place. Maybe Dillon can because he's my husband, but...
I can see all the things.
But otherwise, sometimes transformation isn't it can't be observed by other people, at least not at first, or, it's tricky.
Yeah. So
we can't make those judgments fully, but... so let's just end by really, well, I'm just going to say it. So kenosis is all about letting go of ego, right? And this attachment to self. Kenosis is also a commitment to reality as it is. And I know that in our social justice warrior kind of culture, and listen, me too, I think that I have the answers. I think that my moral compass is right. I also always want to have the ability to back up and see that I can't possibly have it all right. So kenosis is not about, let me just see if I can explain this. Kenosis is a commitment to reality. Jesus was going to be crucified. He knew that this was a possibility, or maybe even he knew it was inevitable. And yet he did not fight it. He even told his disciples to put down their swords when he was arrested. He didn't fight it. He got on a donkey and rode into Jerusalem, the city where he was about to be tortured and killed. He was committed to this reality. At some level, he accepted it. That doesn't mean he wanted it, but he did accept it. Do you know what I mean? Am I using the language right there? He accepted it. And that's what kenosis is. At some level, it's surrendering to reality. It's seeing the world as it is. And this acceptance, this surrendering, that's not the same as being complacent. So don't misunderstand me. That doesn't mean we just lay down and take abuse. That doesn't mean we don't go and rally. It doesn't mean we don't go and support our people who are being oppressed. It doesn't mean that we don't scream in anger sometimes and say, this is wrong. It doesn't mean we don't speak truth to power, or as Nadia Bolz-Weber would say, speak truth to stupid. That doesn't mean that we're complacent. But there is a certain peace. And the last thing I'm not actually going to say this. So the self-emptying of self, this kenosis, this is about getting the stuff that distracts us, our anger, our annoyances, our egos, our attachments to the stories that we tell about how things should be, out of the way long enough to hear the voice of God tell us the next step in whatever it is that you're doing in this season of your life. Parenting, writing a book, activism work, resting, focusing on cooking good food, embodying practices, going to school, going to your job, trying to get that promotion, whatever it is that you're doing right now. Or not doing. Maybe you're resting and you're really committed to rejuvenating and resting and whatever it is. You can't know when it's time to take action or take a next step if you are so wrapped up and obsessed over how you think things should be. When there is something to do to help bring a better reality into existence, you will be notified. But if you're so hung up on controlling reality and manipulating those around you and thinking that you have the answers about how things should be, you aren't going to hear the voice tell you or feel that gentle nudge tell you, hey, it's your time. Now's the time. You're going to write a book about this topic and I'm going to help you. Right? That's the divine voice. So that's kenosis. Kenosis is emptying the idea that you know what's best. Jesus did not want to die. He was scared. There's stories that point to that fear because he was human and he was going to feel pain, and it was terrible. But he did it anyway. He didn't fight it because he knew this is the way. Here I go.
Jesus
is how things are unfolding.
Jesus at his crucifixion on the cross said two contradicting things, and yet for me,
they're the expression of the same
they're
thing.
not contradictory, but for modern people they would be contradictory. Jesus on the cross, throughout the four Gospels, the four Gospels say different things, and when you put them together, I love the Good Friday tradition of the 7 last words of Jesus. Jesus simultaneously says he always says 7 things, but he says 2 things in particular. He says, forgive them, for they not know what they do. So Jesus sees the evils of the empire. He sees them putting people to death and not allowing the fullness of God's kingdom to come in. And Jesus, in some way, in both his divinity and his humanity, has compassion on the literal people that put him to death, that hang him on a cross, that put him on trial, and he is a martyr for it. And yet he calls for repentance and forgiveness and reconciliation. And I know we could talk more about that. Yes. And at another state in which he finds himself on the cross, we're told, at least, he says, depending on which version of the Bible, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mm-hmm. Why have you abandoned me? Right. And so simultaneously, you can have the fullness of God and dwell in, and you might feel abandoned, and yet at the same time, you might feel the fullness. Does this make sense? The fullness.
Well, it does, and you're touching on part of kenosis.
The fullness of saying, I want reconciliation, I want repentance, I want forgiveness. And there's more to reconciliation, repentance, and forgiveness than what we're...
The reason Dillon is saying that is because I just finished a book called Repentance and Repair.
Yeah,
I think that's what it's called.
Yeah.
And he's been using words like repentance, and this was written by a Jewish rabbi, and I love all things Jewish, and I have been tearing Dillon apart whenever he says like atonement. I'm like, well, actually, atonement and forgiveness are not synonyms, and I'm like,
which I never said that they were. But
no, but I'm being very nuanced with him when he uses these words now and making sure we define them right.
I'm also reminding Samantha. Here's our little tip. I'm also reminding Samantha that. Atonement and other things, people see them in different ways. Different traditions see them in different ways, and we have to recognize that.
But kenosis, so you were just talking about the cross. Part of kenosis that Jesus demonstrates is sometimes when we empty ourselves and can live according to, and again, the word God I struggle with sometimes. I'm trying to get over it, but it's hard for me. But just reality, because we're not in control of reality. That doesn't mean we don't play a part in it. It doesn't mean that we should just all surrender to the powers that be. No, Jesus flipped tables too, right? We get to be angry. We get to go and rally. We get to be activists. We get to have our beliefs and our morals about how things should go. We can't be overly attached to them. Our daughter's coming in if you hear her. But part of kenosis is we might not fully understand. Just like maybe Jesus was saying, why have you forsaken me? We might not fully understand exactly why we are being notified to do something, right? So we're going to close up. But so Dillon is leaving the room because our daughter is up here. But so to close up, I want to say this too. Kenosis is often talked about in the other direction too. So Jesus, the human, emptied himself to be more fully aligned with God. But Jesus, the God, also emptied himself of divinity. I don't like calling God him, but because Jesus is wrapped up in this, I almost have to. But of divinity in order to be fully human. So if that's blowing your mind, that's okay. But just know that that's another part. If you start looking into this kenosis thing, that's another way it's discussed. And we could do a whole other episode on that. In no way, I just want to really specify this because we talked about a lot of unplanned things in this episode. We, in no way, believe that Christianity is the one true way. I think it's one door into a large house with many entrances into this house. But for me, for me, I love the humanity embedded into the whole Christian story. I don't need an enlightened religious figure who escapes the human experience. I need a God that fully enters this crazy human experience. That's what I need. I'm already very good at disassociation. I'm already very good at being anywhere but here and now. I need a story. I need a religion. I need a faith that grounds me to here and now. And the Jesus story does that for me. And Jesus did this through emptying, this process of kenosis, right? And if this blows your mind, I just want to end. This is my last thing. If this blows your mind, sit with it for a while. Take the concept of kenosis, take it for a walk around the block, carry it in your pocket for a few months, and see if it shifts anything within you. Remember, Philippians says that Jesus did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but instead just emptied himself. So this kenosis, it's not something that we understand with our minds. It is something we experience with our lives, right? So try that. If you don't understand it, just know that not everything is to be understood. Also, this is a disclaimer for every episode. Dillon and I are never trying to persuade anybody to believe anything. If this doesn't have any kind of personal relevance to you, all right, that's fine. Just leave it. That's totally fine. So again, kenosis is not something we understand with our minds. It's something we experience with our lives. So try to experience it more than understand it. Be sure to listen next week. New episodes come out every Sunday. And you can follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcast. Have a good week.